Okay, good morning. Time now a few minutes after 8 o'clock in the morning in Tokyo, Friday, October the 8th, 2021. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Group Morning Seminar organized by the World Bank Tokyo office. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize so many online seminars introducing the latest report presented by the World Bank Group economists and specialists. This morning, we are pleased to be able to feature the latest edition of the report titled Groundswell, Acting on Internal Climate Migration, which came out on September the 13th. This is the second edition of the Groundswell report, and the first edition originally came out in March 2018. In fact, we featured this 2018 edition at the third morning seminar. And then today we are marking the 121st seminar. It's great to have opportunity of keep featuring the report, a very important report, which is coming out, repeatedly. Connecting from Washington, we have two experts who are the lead authors of the report. Let me introduce very briefly each one of them. Contact my regard, the lead environment specialist connecting from Washington. Kanta, how are you? Good evening, good morning to you. Can you hear us?
Good morning. Good morning, Koichi. Pleasure to be here with my colleague Vivian.
Great. Thank you very much. And we have Vivian Clement, the Senior Climate Change Specialist, connecting also from Washington. Vivian, good morning, good evening to you.
Morning. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting us.
Great. Vivian was the one who presented the earlier edition of the reports 2018, and then we are always pleased to be able to, welcome back the Vivian Clements to be a part of our seminar. Thank you very much for being with us. Following their presentation, I will read your questions. If you didn't have opportunities to send your questions in advance, please do so even during the seminar using online form posted on the announcement page of the seminar, or you can simply post your questions on the chat section of the YouTube screen as usual. I'll read your questions after a keynote presentation by Kanta and Vivian, asking them to respond. With that, I'd like to ask Kanta and Vivian to come in to make the presentation. Kanta and Vivian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Koichi, for the introduction. And we look forward to this presentation, and congratulations on your 121st event. Here we go. I think we have the slides on the screen. Okay, good morning, everybody. And it's a pleasure, as we said, to be here. Today, we're going to talk to you about internal climate migration. And in particular, we're going to focus on the findings from the latest Groundswell report, which is a sequel to the first report. And so the way we'd like to do our presentation is, some of you may have been there for the first presentation, but maybe not. So what we'd like to do is to set the stage on what these reports are about, and then and the methodology. We will then go into the global level results before we do the deep dives into the new regions, of which East Asia is one. And finally, we end up with a call to action and then into the discussion. So let me first of all start off by saying that where are we in terms of internal climate migration, and what is our focus? Our focus in this particular case is on internal climate migration. And that simply means that it's the movement of people within countries as a consequence of climate change. Now, this is a little bit different from cross-border movement, and often the question is asked as to why we focus on internal climate migration, that is movement within the countries. It is maybe a fairly well-known fact, but worth mentioning again, that 3 out of 4 people actually move within their countries. And that's really an important part of the development conversation that we have. The second focus of our report is looking at slow onset climate change. And in this context, we look at 3 particular factors: water availability, crop productivity changes, and sea level rise compounded by storm surge. So as apart from sort of extreme events that do cause movements and evacuations, we're looking at the slow onset, which bring about protracted impacts and mobility as a consequence. The third part of our study is the time duration, and we look at the range between now and 2050. We believe that this is a sort of a medium-term scale within which planners and policymakers can take action. So that's really the spotlight on the climate, migration, and development nexus. But a little bit more then about what exactly are we sort of talking about when we're referring to this issue. It's really can be sort of best illustrated with a set of questions that unpack what we're trying to do. So we're really trying to look at how many people will move under future climate scenarios. We know that climate is changing, and we know that the scientists have put out a range of scenarios, and we try to understand how many people could be moving as a consequence of climate change. The second question is, where are the potential hotspots? This brings in the spatial dimension of where people would be moving out of and where they would be moving to. The third question relates to what extent is climate change a driver of mobility under these different future scenarios. We know that people move for many reasons. It may be social, it may be economic, sometimes political, but what we wanted to find out here is to what extent climate change is a potent driver. The fourth question relates to the implications for medium and longer term development planning, and then on to what are some of the key policies and practices that can help address the adverse consequences of mobility, with a view really to optimize the kind of sustained and durable solutions. So really the focus here is on possible future horizons to help policymakers better plan and prepare for the likely movement of people in the country due to climate change. And this focus, again, is one that was fairly new in the sense that oftentimes people are focusing on the current state of crisis, which is clearly important when evacuations and when mobility takes place. But this report series is really looking at the future horizon so that we can better understand it and in consequence, better plan and prepare for it. Now, what did we do? We applied what we call a scenario-based modeling approach, where we brought in the best globally applicable data sets from the scientific community. In this scenario-based approach, we start with what we call the pessimistic or the reference scenario. This is a scenario which basically is a reflection of high emissions. That is, we continue with the emissions almost as a business as usual now without sort of reducing them. And we couple that with what we call unequal development. And from this pessimistic scenario, we look at an alternative scenario where we give more importance to the inclusive development. And we look at a third scenario where we emphasize climate friendly. That means we go towards low emission scenario in the realm of the Paris Agreement. This scenario-based approach then allows us to understand what are the consequences of moving from pessimistic to more inclusive and more climate friendly. But in terms of the modeling itself, what we did is that we applied what you call a gravity model, a population gravity model, which basically works under the assumption that people move towards or away from a region, from a locality because of the characteristics within that. And we modeled it at a 14-kilometer grid cell where we brought in data on the climate impacts, which is the simulations of crop and water models, as well as we brought in demographic data because we know populations do increase over time, and we look at it against those scenarios of high and low emissions. And this data is then configured at a 14-kilometer grid cell. But before we applied that, we also did a development of a model where we did a backcasting and a calibration from 1990 to 2000, 2000 to 2010, before we projected into the future. And in this way, we got a spatial context of the shifts in movement in the pattern. And when we looked at the scenario with and without climate, we were able to isolate the amount of people who would be moving as a consequence of climate change. And because we modeled it at a 14-kilometer grid cell, we aggregated that up to the national scale and then up to getting to the regional numbers that we will share with you in a while. So that was the methodology, and it's really been a pioneering methodology that brought together geographers, scientists, and demographers to apply that model for the very first time. And so since we applied it in 2018, for the 3 regions that we looked at then, we've now used that same methodology for the Groundswell 2 report. And coming back, I think we were saying about how people move as a consequence of a whole host of regions. And so here now what we're presenting is what is the potency for climate as an additional factor for that movement. So the results we have here now combined for the 2 reports, we find that there are, for the 6 regions that we modeled, we have a total of 216 million people who could be moving within their own countries by 2050 as a consequence of climate change. That is especially if we do not take concrete climate and development action. But as you can see, not all regions are equal. And we find that sub-Saharan Africa would have the highest number of people. And this really is a reflection of the vulnerability of some of the poorest areas where people are engaged in climate sensitive livelihoods, that you would see 86 million people moving in sub-Saharan Africa without action. This is followed by East Asia with 49 million, and then South Asia with 40 million. Numbers in themselves do not tell the whole story, because in North Africa, we have 19 million people who could be moving, but that 19 million people is a larger share of the population than in some of the other regions. But at the end of the day, what we also find is that no region is immune to this movement. But beyond the numbers, we looked at the trajectory between now and 2050 to see how the scale of climate migration would go. And what you have here is 3 vertical columns. And the first one is a pessimistic reference scenario that we talked about, which is the high emissions coupled with unequal development. In the middle, you have inclusive development, where you have good, inclusive, resilient development. And then you have the climate friendly. And you can see in all of these across the horizontal lines where we are comparing 3 sub-regions, North Africa, Lower Mekong, and Central Asia. Consistently across the 3 regions, we find that the pessimistic reference scenario yields the most number of people moving as a consequence of climate change. And on the other hand, the more climate friendly retains the lowest numbers. And so I think with these 2 reports, for the first time, we were able to demonstrate using a database approach and using the models to reaffirm through this second report again that climate change is a potent driver of mobility. And the second message here is locality matters. It really depends on what is going to play out in the context of a particular locality based on the features and geographic features and the climate patterns and the demographics of that region. But the trends across the 3 regions are quite similar. So beyond the trajectory now, we look at how the scenarios, the 3 scenarios that we look at play out in terms of the scale of the issue. And I think what this figure shows is that when you take it for the regions as a whole, which is the figure on the left-hand side, you could reduce the high end of 216 million down to about 44 million, which is almost an 80% reduction if we went from the pessimistic scenario of high emissions and unequal development towards the climate-friendly scenario. And even from the pessimistic, if you move to the inclusive development, you also reduce the numbers significantly. And this pattern kind of plays out across the regions with slight variation sometimes depending on the climate anomalies. But the message here is overarchingly that if we cut our global emissions and that we pursue green, inclusive, resilient development, we could reduce those numbers significantly and taken as a global total by as much as 80%. So these are really the global level results, with some of the regional level outlooks. Let me pass it now to my colleague, Vivian Clement, who will speak to you about some of the deep dives that we did in the region. Over to you, Vivian.
Thank you, Kanta. And please bear with me while I share the screen here and adjust the settings so that everybody can see. Hopefully, can everyone see that presentation?
Yes, we can, Vivian, but we see the next slide as well. So maybe you want to go to presenter mode.
Sure, absolutely. I'm trying to do that now. So just bear with me one moment. Sorry, it's something on my display settings. Kanta, if you wouldn't mind sharing, then we can
do
get
that.
like this. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you. So as Kanta was mentioning, what I'd like to do right now is to take you through some deep dives into the sub-regions and countries of focus that we looked at in the report. As she mentioned, locality is going to matter critically. And this means that the way that climate vulnerabilities, the slow onset impacts that we look at through the report, demographic patterns, existing patterns of migration, key economic sectors, the way in which these elements are going to interact are going to be different and how they're going to play out in terms of scale, trend, and spatial patterns of potential internal climate migration. And so this is why in the context of the report, in addition to looking at the 3 new regions more broadly, we did sub-regions of focus deep dive. So the ones we did are North Africa, we did the lower Mekong countries, as well as Central Asia. And then those corresponded to further country case studies where we further draw out the context and the results further. And those 3 country case studies were Morocco, Vietnam, and the Kyrgyz Republic. So to tell you a little bit about these deep dives and the sub-regional results, going back to this message about locality matters critically, one of the key results of the report, as Kanta mentioned, is on the hotspots. And we see in the context of the report that these climate migration hotspots are set to intensify in rural, urban, and coastal systems. And indeed, these climate migration hotspots emerge as early as 2030, and they're going to spread and intensify by 2050. They're set to do so. And of course, the implications for rural areas and urban areas are going to be quite different. You can see here on the map on the left-hand side, the hotspot map for North Africa. And you can see that intensification of the hotspots happening between the 2030 map that's on the top and the 2050 map that is on the bottom. Those areas that are depicted in blue are climate out migration hotspots, areas where people would move out of or would see dampened population growth because of the slow onset impacts that we looked at in the report. So increasing water scarcity, decreases in crop productivity, and the impacts of sea level rise. And the areas depicted in red are going to be areas that have relatively favorable, more favorable conditions along these 3 factors, and that would attract people to move into them. So in the context of North Africa, to describe what this looks like a little bit, the story is really about water scarcity and the role that this increasing water scarcity is going to play in terms of potentially driving people out of inland areas and certain coastal areas into areas that are growing coastal urban centers. And of course, in the case of the low-lying Nile Delta, the impacts of sea level rise are being felt. And that is why you see it there depicted as a climate out migration hotspot. Next slide, please, Kanta. And so we took that deeper look in the context of Morocco for North Africa. And again, to contextualize further the results in terms of that national level and local level context, in terms of key livelihoods, population dynamics, etc. So we see for Morocco that at least in terms of rural areas on the top left-hand side, that rain-fed croplands and pastoral rangelands are particularly prevalent. And we know that the agricultural sector is still a key sector. Morocco, of course, being a quite diversified economy, but with agriculture still playing an important role in terms of livelihoods and also in terms of employment. At the same time, we do see that concentration of people in coastal areas and in cities. And that is depicted on the bottom left-hand map. We know that these urban centers, particularly on the coast, are already a destination for rural to urban migrants, for young people seeking other opportunities. And so how does that interface with the hotspots that we identify in the context of the report? And this you see on the upper right-hand side. And here again, the issue of water scarcity, of increasing water scarcity, really comes to the fore. And that is one of the key drivers for Morocco in terms of potentially leading people to move out of certain inland areas, including, for example, the Central Atlas foothills that you see there depicted in blue on the map, into those growing coastal urban cities. So places like Rabat, places like Tangiers and the Tingitana Peninsula more generally. So what does this mean in terms of action that can be taken at the national level, for example, to take some of these dynamics into account? And so we highlighted the report that in the context of Morocco, things like implementing long-term strategies for managing water resources, adapting sensitive sectors to climate change, but at the same time, in parallel, pursuing these key low carbon and resilient economic transitions. Morocco, of course, is one of the leaders in terms of climate action along several of these areas and has several long-term strategies in place to manage, for instance, water resources. Next slide, please, Kanta. And so now what I'd like to touch on is a little bit of a deeper look at the next country case study that we did, which is the case of Vietnam. And this is really to show you again that that locality is going to matter critically, and the combination of different factors and the way they're going to play out are really going to be different according to different geographic areas and localities. So in the case of Vietnam, the main impacts here are related to the impacts of sea level rise. And so you can see here on the left-hand map that the 1 and 2 meter sea level rise, how it's going to affect low-lying areas, and in particular the Mekong Delta, which hosts, as we know, these key livelihood systems, rice culture, fisheries, aquaculture, among many other things. But in the case of Vietnam, it's not just about the impacts of sea level rise. For some of these out-migration hotspots, particularly in the lower Mekong Delta, this is combined with impacts related to increasing water scarcity, and also to some level decreases in crop productivity. And the movement that is going to be out of the climate migration hotspots is going to be, in this case, towards coastal urban centers. Places like the Central Coast that you can see there depicted in red on the map, and the capital city, Hanoi. And this is to note that these coastal centers, particularly on the Central Coast, are themselves already exposed to certain sudden onset events, flooding and cyclones, among others. And so it's important to think about how the slow onset factors that we identify and look at in the report, how these are going to layer on top of these compounding factors that are related to the rapid onset events. And something important to note in the context of Vietnam is that even those areas that are identified as climate out migration hotspots, these are going to still support large numbers of people. And so planning and anticipatory action would need to be taken accordingly. And so in the case of Vietnam, things like promoting regional development and creating new livelihoods that are viable in rural areas, and all the while embedding climate resilience into urban planning, are going to be some particularly important elements in terms of planning. Go ahead, Kanta, next slide, please. I wanted to touch on a little bit on the two areas that we did not model quantitatively in the report, but that we cover in a qualitative narrative. And those are the Middle East and the small island developing states, which are also going to be affected, as we know, by climate change and could see climate migration as well. We cover the Mashrek countries in a qualitative chapter, and here we emphasize, for example, how factors related to water scarcity, heat stress, and natural resource degradation could increasingly act as push factors for migration in these countries that are adding to compounding shocks. And in the context of small island developing states, in particular the Pacific Island states, where sea level rise is shrinking available land area, and this compounded with extreme events and impacts on key livelihood systems, how this plays into questions around long-term habitability. But of course, the small island developing states also taking a leadership role in the regional and global policy stage on integrating questions of migration and climate resilience in that regional and global policy dialogue. And we try to highlight some of these aspects in the report. Next slide, please, Kanta. Thank you. And now I hope that gave you a little bit of a deep dive into some of our regional and country level results. And now I'd like to zoom back out again and go over with you the key policy recommendations for the report. And we really emphasize here that the window to act is still open, but not for long. And we highlight action in 4 key areas in particular that can be taken at that intersection of climate, migration, and development. So the first key recommendation is at the global level around the need to cut global greenhouse gases. And that is really to reduce the climate pressures that can drive people to migrate and drive climate migration, and particularly that would be driven to migrate under conditions of distress. The second key policy recommendation that we highlight is around planning. So integrating climate migration into far-sighted, green, resilient, and inclusive development planning. For that recommendation, we highlight things like the management of demographic transitions to foster momentum towards the next generation of green jobs and skills. We highlight the need to invest in human capital. We also highlight the climate smart urban transitions, given the role that urban centers across the regions that we look at in the report play in terms of both climate in migration and out migration hotspots. Our third key recommendation is around planning for each phase of migration, before movement, during movement, and after movement. And this is to ensure that when migration does happen, that it can represent a positive adaptation strategy and result in good development outcomes. So to give you a few examples, and when we talk about before movement, it's things like having options in place for viable livelihood so that people can adapt in place. During movement, it's ensuring social and flexible rather, and adaptive social protection systems, enabling informed decision making so that movement can take place in a well-managed manner. And after movement, ensuring the social cohesion between host communities and migrants, particularly in receiving areas, are just a few examples from this recommendation. And our last recommendation is around understanding. So investing in understanding the drivers of climate migration through evidence-based research, models, and bottom-up consultations. And this is really to inform a policy response that is well targeted to the particular locality. So the model of the Groundswell report can be taken and expanded and taken to more granular levels, and this will help towards that increased understanding and to inform the policy response. So those are the key takeaways in the context of the report. I hope we also were able to shed some light on some of the key results. We have here some of the useful links, including links to the report and some of the other content, including short videos and a feature story. So please feel free to consult that if you have further interest. So thank you very much for your attention, and we very much look forward to the questions and to the discussion as well.
Thank you very much, Kanta and Vivian, for your presentation. taking us through the bigger picture story, and then results, and then regional deep dives, and the policy actions in a very short time. So thank you very much. So we received some questions from the viewers as usual, and let me read those questions asking our speakers to respond. Green. The first question from Sasaki-san. Thank you very much for your question. On the slide 8, showing the size of the internal migrants in East Asia and the Pacific is larger than that of South Asia, while people below the poverty line are concentrating in Africa and South Asia, and much fewer number of the people below the poverty line in East Asia and the Pacific. How should we interpret this point? So this is the first question I would like to ask two speakers to come in to respond. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, and I can come in on this one. So as Kanta mentioned, first of all, I think I guess the numbers don't tell the whole story, of course, right? And with the numbers need to come that interpretation of the spatial patterns and also in terms of the trends. But with regard to the specific regional results, in the context of East Asia, several factors are driving that particular number, including a large baseline population, which is why, in part, we see that level of scale of potential to 2050. You'll also notice that, for South Asia in particular, the scale of climate migration is really reflective of some of the key climate vulnerabilities and impacts that are going to be felt in that particular subregion. And in the context of South Asia, certain countries also drive those numbers. So Bangladesh, for example, as we know, very vulnerable in terms of low-lying areas and low-lying urban centers, and drive the numbers in the context of South Asia. And as Kanta mentioned, there are other nuances in some of the other regional results. For example, North Africa showing a higher relative proportion of climate migrants relative to total population. So each different region, in terms of that scale, has different dynamics at play to result in that in the final potential scale of climate migration to 2050. And just to keep that in mind, and when looking at the overall regional results. Kanta, please feel free to add if you would like. So thank you for that question.
Thank you for your responses. Let me continue reading the next question. Question from Mori-san. Thank you very much for your question. We often discuss urbanization as a challenge or pressure in the process of people moving from rural areas to urban areas, looking for economic and other opportunities. People moving out of very congesting urban areas to rural or less density areas may not always be a bad option for them from a viewpoint of the quality of life and looking for potential opportunities. And rural or smaller cities may be able to seize the potential economic opportunities as more people coming into their areas. So instead of stopping them, I think it would be better to plan and prepare for creating potential opportunities for internal migrants. So this is rather maybe a comment instead of the question, but if you'd like to, make some reflection on this point, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Koichi. I think it's worth making a reflection, I think, because it's a very good reflection in itself, right? So I have 2 points that I'd like to make. First of all, I think in this report, what we are showing and drawing out is the potency for climate to drive mobility in possibly an adverse context, right? Because we're talking about water stress, or we're talking about drops in crop productivity or sea level rise. And that's why you have some of the push factors, but you also have the pull factors in other localities where the features may be more attractive. So I think our concern is largely around the issue of the adverse consequences that climate change can place, and therefore how understanding these patterns and trajectories can better help us to plan and prepare now. But the point made by the person asking the question is an important one about then having the information to better plan and prepare so that you don't have these adverse consequences. And at the same time, as Vivian was saying, you can better plan some of the transitions, whether they are in the urban areas or in the rural areas. But an important point I think we want to make here is that even when we are talking about people moving out of an area, it should be recognized that even when, especially when they are big cities, we're not saying that the population numbers are going to drop. We're saying that they're going to be dampened because oftentimes population is still increasing, not so much perhaps in East Asia, but for example, in Sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, oftentimes the same locality is going to see a doubling of the population. So we need to better plan in those cities, but rightly, we have an emergence of secondary cities that we know are going to happen. And so how can we plan that movement? So for example, in Ethiopia, where we found that there will be a movement out from the rain-fed areas towards the south, then it's important that we prepare that for that kind of movement if needed, prepare the right kind of skill sets, especially for the youth who may not be so engaged in agriculture or look for alternative opportunities. So I think all of what we're saying here is that this is an insight into how climate as an additional factor is going to become more potent, and how do we need to plan for the green, resilient, inclusive development that Vivian was talking about through the different kind of instruments that are best suited, that can only be discussed and designed in that local context. But I think it's a very good question, and I think it's one that we want the planners to think about and policymakers.
Thank you very much. As we continue this conversation, we keep receiving actually questions coming in from the viewers. So we'll try to read those questions also. But let me continue reading a question which we received in advance. Question from Takashi-san. Thank you very much. Any suggestion or advice to the private sector for potential future actions to prepare for internal migrants?
Thanks for that question, which is a very important one. And I think to some extent links back to what Kanta was just talking about in terms of managing the transitions, right? Whether these are in urban areas or rural areas in terms of new livelihoods or making others more resilient. We try to make the point in the report, and this is around this framework of green, inclusive, and resilient development, that a big part of this is to ensure a transition in terms of skill set and in terms of economic and employment opportunities. What are those going to be looking like in different receiving areas? What are those going to be looking like in different sending areas? And what is that next generation of skills and green jobs going to be looking like? And we see, for example, that this could be a role in terms of the private sector, in terms of promoting what are going to be those skill sets and those job opportunities of the future in the way that is also tailored to different localities and different contexts. Thank you.
Let me just add here, Koichi, to what Vivian just said on some specific private sector enterprises that become really important to help countries prepare and for the climate change that is already upon us in some ways around the agribusiness industries, right? So whether you're moving towards, because I think Vivian mentioned 3 steps that we think of, 3 phases of migration, which are really important. The first is how can we make sure that we can help communities, for example, especially in rural areas, to better adapt in place. So if we know that water scarcity is going to be an issue there, or crop productivity losses, agribusiness, both through their research and their industry, can help with sort of the drought varieties or better management of water through drip irrigation or through more efficient systems, or through early warning systems, or bringing climate information services to bear so that people have early warning systems. Because oftentimes People do not want to move immediately, but if the situation does not help them to sustain their livelihoods, then the consequences of mobility are enhanced. So private sector really has an important role to together with the planners to look at these hotspots, in and out, and what are the kind of nature of enterprises that can come in. So I've just given you an example from agriculture. Similarly, in the coastal areas, there's also different types of enterprises. And we know the private sector is already working about it. But I think the fact that some of these future scenarios can help us to understand the demand or the expected needs for this would be very helpful.
Thank you for your responses. Let me continue reading the question that we received from the anonymous participant. Thank you very much for sending questions always. Let me read this one. Vulnerable people tend to be exposed to higher risk of mobility issues related to both forced displacement and limitation of freedom of mobilization. To analyze complicated mobility causes, deeply aggregated analysis may be needed. How did you cover, or how will you put this point into advanced or future research? And that's one. Then let me continue that one more question from the same person, then ask the team to respond comprehensively. The term climate refugee is not generally endorsed or recognized, though the report discusses about increasing mobility driven by the climate-related issues. Will the World Bank suggest that definition of refugee be broadened, or the migrant status be further supported and treated be equally with nationals in host countries? It's a bit interesting question, but let me ask the team to respond if you have any comments to those 2 points. Thank you.
Vivian, you want to take the first one, and maybe I'll take the second.
Absolutely. The point, the first question about that more granular understanding is a very important one, and echoes the sort of fourth key recommendation that we have of the report in terms of investing in that deeper understanding. And so I guess to make the point that with the Groundswell methodology and when looking at a particular locality, to the extent possible, to incorporate different factors, whether they're climate-related factors, environmental-related factors, social or economic, that would be important in the context of that particular locality. And the model, can be adjusted. It's a spatial model, a modified form of a gravity model can be modified to include, for example, differentiated climate impacts, additional demographic factors, or socioeconomic factors, in order to give that more nuanced look that is more granular to that particular locality. So the model does lend itself to that, and can also be taken at a more granular level in terms of spatial unit. And so some of those aspects, including the incorporation of different factors and more granular spatial levels, are some of the things that we are exploring in current and future work as applied to different regions where we are working. So the participant really sort of hit the nail on the head in terms of where the methodology can be taken next, and how that, combined with consultations in the particular localities, can ensure that the results that come out of this are dovetailing well with the understanding on the ground of the local context. And really, of course, the view is to inform that more tailored policy response. So that's really where some of this future work can lie. So over to you, Kanta.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. On the question about climate refugees, maybe useful to just take a step back. We do have, UNHCR that oversees the refugee, I think the Geneva Convention, that looks at movement under that convention of people who move due to political strife or persecution. It's a very specific definition to what the refugee constitutes in that extent. To that extent, climate is not a consideration within that. And, I think from us, for the World Bank, we don't really want to make a pronouncement of whether that's, something that should happen. But I think what is worth noting is that some of the global processes, like the Global Compact for Migration that was negotiated in 2018 as well, I believe, does refer to the fact of understanding better the climate underlying factors, including climate, that could cause movement. Similarly, there are regional conventions like the Kampala Convention that do pay attention and sort of recognize the need to address the needs of people who are moving as a consequence of climate change. I don't think they go so far as to label something, but they recognize climate as a driver of mobility and the need to address those needs. I think where we would like to come back to a little bit is, I think, the motivation and the engagement of the bank on this issue, which is from the nexus of climate, migration, and development. And as you can see, I think in a lot of the analysis that we did, it really underscores the critical importance of addressing both the underlying development needs as well as the needs that would be amplified as a consequence of climate change, and how addressing those can help to reduce the scale of climate-induced mobility. So Koichi, I think we wanted to come back to you on that critical importance, and that's also why we looked at internal climate migration in this particular case, recognizing what is it that we need to do to understand the issues at source or on the ground in terms of addressing some of these. But we do recognize that even internally displaced people, there is room for us to work together with different communities, right? So we have the development community, we have the humanitarian community, we have the disaster response community, which obviously, you know, Japan is quite a leader in. And I think, so we think these communities can come together, practice to relieve that kind of adverse consequences of climate change.
Thank you for your responses. We received several other questions from the viewers who actually are watching this seminar live. So let me read the 3 questions that we received from Faji. Thank you very much for your question. Thank you for the explanation. First, as Africa is a region that has the most impact in terms of the climate change, where is the direction of the migration will be? Assuming the direction of the migration will be to Europe, how is the preparation of the Europe, in your opinion? I think he was talking about the international migrant, but that's the first question. And then second question, how is the correlation between the climate change migration and the social conflict around the world, especially in Africa? So this is the second question related to climate change migration and conflict correlations. Third one, how is the response of the government included in the case study, Vietnam, Morocco, etc.? So, you know, any reactions from the government, analyzed in the report. So those are 3 sets of questions from Faji. Over to you.
Why don't I let Vivian take the third question first, and of course any of the other 2, because I think I'd like to come back to the areas of focus of the report, and then we can come to the other 2 questions you raised. For Africa, certainly I can answer that, yes.
Absolutely, and thank you for that. Yes, as part of the 3 country case studies that we did, what we did with the results is also undertake a consultation in the country, virtually in this context, but we were able to dialogue with, the counterparts in terms of the planners, in terms of academia, and other stakeholders in civil society to see how these results resonate with the current, policy and national level context. And what we found across the board is, I guess really related to our last policy recommendations, which is, it felt like it was contributing to a deeper understanding, not just of the nuances within the very broad issue of migration itself, but also a deeper understanding of some of the social related impacts on climate change. And then how does that also play into different economic sectors and different localities that are important in the context of the country level. So the results really resonated in terms of contributing to that deeper understanding. In some cases, the countries, saw that, some of the policies that they were undertaking, particularly in terms of long-term planning in key sectors, were an avenue to help alleviate or build resilience to the climate-related impacts, particularly the ones that were highlighted as being drivers of potential migration in their country context. And in others, it really put the spotlight on the need for that integrated spatial and regional development in terms of how to ensure different areas are connected, and also what that would look like in terms of spatial population distribution shifts, and how to promote a viable, resilient livelihoods in those particular localities. So just to sum up that, it contributed to that more nuanced understanding of both what, how climate impacts could play out in terms of migration, and also a broader understanding of the dynamics of migration in the country context as well. But yeah, over to you, Kanta.
Thank you very much. Maybe just to reflect on the questions around Africa. Yes, we did focus on Africa, sub-Saharan Africa as a region in the first report. And as the question rightly points out, the scale of the possible scale of internal climate migration was estimated at 86 million, which is the highest across all of the regions. And this is obviously because of the the disproportionate amount of poor in the region, as well as people engaged in climate sensitive livelihoods and movement in the coastal areas. In terms of what is it that we are looking at in terms of conflict, since we did the Groundswell report, and as Vivian mentioned, the fourth recommendation calls for more granular analysis. We have been undertaking that, where we expanded the Groundswell model that I set out earlier in the methodology part to bring in more factors. And what we've added in is the factor of the flood risk as an extreme event, but really also as a persistent issue that is recurrent. We also layered in the data from what we call the armed conflict location data into the model as a mask to show how the potency of conflict in an area could interact with the gravity model so that people tend to disperse differently. In the case of the modeling right now, I mean, the way that the conflict data doesn't seem to give a great correlation, but that's not to say that it won't in the future, but that's where it is. But it's worth noting that in the IDMC, the International Displacement Monitoring Center, they do an estimation each year of the additional number of people who have moved. And what they found in the last year, I believe it was maybe 40-something million, but nevertheless, 3/4 of the people who moved were moving because of hydrometeorological events and extreme events, more related with the climate aspects of it. And 1/4 of them move as a consequence of conflict. But when you look at the regional context of that in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in some localities, the movement is more from conflicts than from hydrometeorological and climate-related, weather-related events. But it's difficult to really unpack that. Research has shown that the meta-analysis has shown that increasingly, some of the underlying factors that cause people to move, even in the case of what is counted as conflict, could be weather and climate related. So we don't really know, but we think it's something that one should watch and learn and analyze in that context. So, but the bottom line is, I think the question was talking about cross-border in terms of moving in which direction. But what our study finds is that the movement is clearly depending on locality. Coastal areas will be vulnerable. People would tend to move away from the coast, although up to now they're still moving towards the larger coastal cities. Internally, it could be moving from rural to urban, but also rural to other rural areas, which can provide them livelihood opportunities in agriculture areas. So it's a very mixed pattern, but just as Vivian presented the results for North Africa and for the Lower Mekong, I mean, the movement is going to be really, emergence of in and out migration hotspots, which also then provides the opportunities for planning and policy discussion.
Thank you very much for your responses. Because of the interest of the time, let me read two more questions from the two participants and ask both of you to respond comprehensively along with your final remarks. Then we wrap up a seminar. First one, question or comment from Mochizuki-san. This area seems to be one of the good examples of the nexus of humanitarian assistance and development because it is a combination of action to the ongoing crisis while dealing with the future risks. I suppose this area is relatively new, but it would be great if you could share with us some successful project implemented or being implemented either by the World Bank or other organizations. So that's the first one, first question from Mochizuki-san. Second one, a comment, a question from the Professor Yoshino. Thank you for your point. Very interesting. Would South Pole become a new continent? A huge population might be able to live in the various regions there. They're currently covered by snow. So it's an interesting, stimulating proposal to fully utilize the South Pole or Antarctic area potentially. But along with that point, I would like to ask Kanta and Vivian to give the final remarks and respond to those questions. Thank you very much.
Vivian, can I take the first question and then yeah. So on the first question, I think that humanitarian and development communities coming to work together, I think that is it's really good and it's a reality now. I think for too long we had a bit of a silo where whenever there is a crisis, we have the humanitarian response that goes in, or even when there are extreme events and disasters, we have those communities that go in and address the very proximate and emergent needs of the communities. And then there tends to be a withdrawal, and then there is not a sustained development, and people are still left coping with crisis. But increasingly, I think there's the communities coming together. So let me give you a couple of examples, and these don't necessarily then relate to internal migration, but we have projects in Rwanda and Burundi where we have, working a little more closer with the UNHCR in the case of refugees, meeting their needs and their development needs, but doing it in a way that is not just focused on the refugees. It's really focused on both the refugees and the host communities, recognizing that we need a social cohesion across also the host and the refugee communities to have a more cohesive and a sort of a environment that is positive. And in this case, the needs of the two communities are assessed and reflected, and the projects address those needs. So that's really, really important in terms of having a more sort of a holistic and integrative response when you have this kind of mobility. And this really relates a little bit to the three phases of the migration cycle that Vivian was referring to, move preparation before you move, and then facilitate the movement that can happen. But the third part, which is really making sure you bring the host and the migrant communities together, is what these projects are doing. And I think they are very illustrative of sort of a positive way moving forward. And let me also give my final remarks and say thank you very much for this opportunity. I found the discussion and the reflections particularly insightful, and that's really what makes the presentation so meaningful. So thank you very much for your participation.
Thanks, Kanta. And maybe I'll just touch on slightly the last question, which really raises an important point about climate in migration hotspots, actually, and the dynamics that occur there. And to give you an example from the report, in the context of Central Asia, some of the northern areas of Central Asia, in Kazakhstan in particular, for example, were identified as a potential climate in migration hotspot because of increasing crop productivity. And this is linked to new areas that could potentially open up for agricultural related livelihoods. But of course, important to keep in mind, what are other dynamics at play? So how do factors such as glacial melt in the context of that particular subregion, how that might affect ecosystem services and affect the favorableness of conditions in that particular in-migration hotspot. So, and in the context of arid landscapes, it's the same, right? If there is in-migration into an area that is already, classified as arid, then there's questions about carrying capacity, particularly if that area is already sustaining a certain level of livelihood. And so I thank you for the participant to raise that question, because it really brings up, that there are also nuances happening from environmental factor and climate related standpoint, even when you're talking about a climate in migration hotspot, which would need to be taken into account in planning accordingly and tailored to the locality. So in fact, thank you for raising that point at the end. And just to add my thanks to Kantas, what rich discussion and questions that we were able to discuss. Thank you for the opportunity to being able to do that. And just hope you have a good rest of your day. And thank you again for inviting us.
Great. Thank you very much. We had a pleasure of having Kanta Kumari Rigaud, lead environment specialist, and Vivian Clement, senior the climate change specialist, connecting us from Washington this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Koichi, for the excellent hosting.
Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Next week, we are featuring the new report titled Ebb and Flow, the Water Migration and Development. So more or less related topic as we discussed this morning. And this will start at 8 a.m. On the Friday, October 15 in Japan Standard Time. And please check our website for the latest information on the other upcoming events as we keep organizing the interesting seminars to feature the new latest report. Once again, thank you very much for tuning in, and have a nice weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy, and see you next week. Thank you.